Ladies and gentlemen, first of all I would like to express my gratitude for the possibility to take part in this exciting project, Worldwide Exemplification of Freemasonry, uniting scholars from different traditions, academic as much as Masonic. Such an initiative is much needed in forging different research traditions together and to meet the challenge to provide with sound information on the history of Freemasonry. My name is Dr. Andreas Onnerfors, and I'm currently working at the universities of Lund and Malmö in Sweden. Between 2007 and 2010, I was the director of the first academic center for research into Freemasonry and fraternalism at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom, where we published a number of working papers and 3 volumes as the outcome of lecture series and different initiatives we were engaged in, such as the International Conference on the History of Freemasonry, ICHF, that in 2011 is taking place in Alexandria, Virginia. We also launched the International Peer-Reviewed Academic Journal for Research into Freemasonry and Fraternalism, which currently is preparing its 3rd issue. It is vital that this scholarly endeavor receives support from the entire research community. The aim of this lecture is to provide with an overview over the evolution of Scandinavian Freemasonry. In the first part of the lecture, I will give a short historical background and outline the first Scandinavian encounters with Freemasonry as a new form of sociability in the early 18th century. In the second part, I will talk about the dissemination of Freemasonry in the Danish and Swedish realm, leading to an early consolidation in Sweden. Finally, I will briefly explain how the Swedish Rite became the dominant Masonic system in Scandinavia, a rite that unites a number of constitutive features. Membership requires Christian faith. 10 degrees are conferred individually in a progressive order within a coherent system of 3 different sections: craft, Scottish and chapter degrees. Ritual performance is intense. My background is within the history of sciences and ideas, where I graduated in 2003 with a doctoral dissertation on cultural encounters between Sweden and its German possession Pomerania in the 18th century. I realized that Freemasonry played an important part in forging the intellectual elites representing different cultural traditions together. National prejudice was overcome in a spirit of tolerant cosmopolitanism. Masonic lodges provided with a zone liberated from religious and cultural particularity, in which instead new forms of sociability and a shared quest for new knowledge was cultivated, communicated through rituals of initiation, symbolism, orations, and various public performances. My research was facilitated substantially through access to archival collections that had been unavailable for more than 200 years, stored by the Masonic lodges themselves, and then plundered by the Nazis, and subsequently kept in communist Eastern Germany for yet another 50 years. This experience proves how important it is for academic research to get access to archives and collections, as they have the potential to contribute to a re-examination of history from a different and extended perspective. Both mainstream history and Masonic history are vitalized substantially through access to new source material that will help to question and scrutinize old truths and assumptions. During my postdoctoral research, I conducted a study on membership in Swedish Freemasonry during the 18th century and found that almost 4,300 men joined Masonic lodges in the Swedish realm during the period 1735 to 1800, which is a remarkable figure for a comparatively small country like Sweden. The Swedish Rite, however, also spread to Germany, the Swedish trading post in Canton in China, as well as to the only colony, the tiny island of Saint-Barthélemy in the Caribbean, and to the Russian Empire, and hence the history of Swedish Freemasonry, together with other Freemasonries, has a global dimension. The topic of this lecture is the evolution of Scandinavian Freemasonry. What we today define as Scandinavia, the 5 Nordic countries Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway and Iceland, was during the early modern period, that witnessed the rise of Freemasonry as an organization, a space divided between 2 major power blocks, the Danish-Norwegian realm and the Swedish realm, that until 1809 also included Finland. It is important to shortly recapitulate the history of these 2 often violently competing entities, as it explains the different routes of introduction of Freemasonry to Scandinavia. The kingdoms of Denmark and Norway were reigned in personal union since the Middle Ages, and Iceland was no autonomous territory. Still today, Greenland and the Faroe Islands are a reminder of the fact that the Danish crown extended its rule across a vast space over the northern Arctic seas. Sweden was much more occupied with to consolidate its dominant position around the Baltic Sea. This basic division lasted for several centuries, until Sweden was challenged by Russia's expansion to the west, which finally led to the fall of Sweden as a great power. But both Denmark and Sweden also were involved in the Holy Roman Empire of German nation, the so-called Old German Empire, already founded in the 9th century by Charles the Great, and into existence more than a millennium as a loose federation of German states until its forced dissolution in 1806. The Danish crown ruled over German territories in the north of Germany and Sweden, was granted German possessions as a compensation for involvement in the 30 Years' War during the 17th century. The long-standing dichotomy between Denmark and Sweden, Sweden was a traditional ally of France, and Denmark of England or Russia. Although both countries were outspokenly Protestant, Sweden introduced a strict Orthodox Lutheran state religion, whereas Denmark was considerably more influenced by evangelical pietism. The first Swedish contacts with Freemasonry during the 1700s took place almost exclusively in Paris and France. An entire Swedish regiment, the Royal Suédois, served under the Swedish crown until 1790, which opened up for a considerable amount of Swedish officers from the nobility serving the French army. And hence the regiment played a constitutive role for the introduction of Freemasonry to Sweden. France and French language dominated cultural life, and hence the French capital also attracted many cultural travelers on their grand tour through Europe. Furthermore, for many political reasons, Sweden did support the Jacobite cause, and many Swedes did not only have direct ties to Jacobite families, both in Britain and in exile, but sympathized in general with the idea of replacement of the Hanoverian government. An important zone of encounters with French Freemasonry was thus created. Since at least 1725, Freemasonry had been introduced to France by Jacobites in exile. Although Hanoverian lodges also were frequented by Swedes, it was Count Axel Vredesparre's contacts to the Jacobite lodges that paved the way for the introduction of Freemasonry to Sweden. Vredesparre was initiated in 1731 and opened a private lodge in the Swedish capital of Stockholm upon his return in 1735, where he initiated Carl Gustaf Tessin. In Sweden celebrated 275 years since the first Masonic gathering in the country. In 1737, Swedish diplomat and politician Carl Friedrich Schäffer received a retrospective warrant to establish lodges in Sweden, together with a copy of the rules and regulations of Freemasonry, both issued by the French Grand Master Charles Radcliffe and countersigned by his predecessor Hector McLean, two prominent Jacobites. The rules and regulations are very similar to Anderson's constitutions. However, the Christian character is much more pronounced in these French documents, a feature that has remained constitutive for the Swedish Rite ever since. In 1738, an article on Freemasonry was published in a Stockholm newspaper, translation from a German and French original, but nevertheless the first evidence of public treatment of Freemasonry in Sweden. Danish noblemen were also initiated into Freemasonry in Paris, but this had no effects on an organizational level related to the introduction of Freemasonry to Denmark. Much more important was the simultaneous establishment of Freemasonry in northern Germany, where the English Grand Lodge had constituted lodges in Hamburg, and a provincial lodge for the territory of Lower Saxony was founded as early as 1738. Since the Danish city of Altona was opposite of Hamburg, and Lower Saxony also comprised Danish territory in Germany, parts of the Danish realm were placed under immediate English Masonic jurisdiction, which of course opened up for the initiation of Danish subjects in Hamburg and a subsequent establishment of Freemasonry in the Danish capital of Copenhagen. The substantial German influence upon Danish cultural history has been denied for a very long time in Danish historiography, not at least because of the complex relationship between Germany and Denmark due to the annexation of Schleswig in the 19th and the occupation of Denmark by the Nazis during the 20th century. However, this influence is important to understand in order to understand the development of Freemasonry in Denmark. German was spoken in the streets of Copenhagen, and German was also the main language of Danish Freemasonry during a huge part of the 18th century. Denmark was, however, also influenced profoundly by evangelical pietism, which early on developed a negative attitude towards Freemasonry, an attitude that still is alive in evangelical Christianity today on a global scale. Therefore, the introduction of Freemasonry to Denmark was also met with the establishment of an anti-Masonic society, a society that paradoxically used many of the features of Freemasonry in order to combat it. But in the long run, Freemasonry became such a significant part of Danish societal life that it was impossible to stop its further spread. Swedish Freemasonry during the 1740s was vitalized significantly through the activities of Scottish General James Keith, who served in the Russian army. While on a political mission to Sweden, he initiated, passed and raised a number of Swedes. In 1746, a commemorative medal was struck on the occasion of the birth of Crown Prince Gustav, future King and Freemason Gustav III. Sweden's support for the Jacobite cause resulted in the organization of a rescue mission after the Battle of Culloden from Scotland to France. During this mission, a temporary lodge, Kilwinning, was opened in the Swedish port town of Ystad in the south of the country. The same year, the first anti-Masonic pamphlet was published in Sweden, unsurprisingly by a radical pietist sect. During the 1740s, a growing number of Swedes not only were initiated abroad, but also made acquaintance with the higher degrees of Freemasonry. The first initiate on Swedish soil, politician Carl Gustaf Tessin, received his Scottish degrees in the famous Scottish Union Lodge in Berlin, constituted already in November 1742. Swedish officer Fredrik Horn was initiated into Freemasonry, its Scottish and higher degrees, during his service in the French army. From Dunkirk, he brought a complete set of rituals for the higher degrees with him to Sweden, a system with 13 degrees dated 1748. Horn later would establish a lodge, L'Union, that worked in the French language in Stockholm. Swedish officer Knut Karlsson Posse made a similar career, both in the French army and in Freemasonry. His encounters with higher degree Freemasonry are highly interesting. Not only did he bring rituals to Sweden in which the later division into 3 distinct units already is apparent, but he mentions explicitly the Christian and knightly character of Freemasonry, as well as refers to that the highest degree of Freemasonry was far from a French fabrication, but originated in England and Scotland, possibly in what today is called the Royal Order of Scotland. Posse received a new constitution from France, with which he in 1752 erected a Swedish mother lodge, Saint-Jean Auxiliaire. Swedish Freemasonry was now definitely on its way to stabilization. In the Danish realm, the situation developed as well in a very dynamic direction. Not only were a number of mainly German-speaking lodges constituted in the capital Copenhagen, but contacts with the higher degrees in Germany, the Union Lodge in Berlin that perceived itself as the Scottish Mother Lodge for Germany, in 1748 led to the establishment of the first Scottish degree lodge in Scandinavia. Furthermore, the first Norwegian lodge was constituted in Christiania, what later became the Norwegian capital, Oslo. The number of lodges in Sweden was constantly growing. Irregular lodges were incorporated into existing or warranted, and in 1760 the Swedish Grand Lodge was formally constituted. Although a number of Freemasons already carried Scottish degrees, and such rituals were worked informally in Sweden previously, the first proper Scottish degree lodge, l'Innocent, was established in 1756 by Carl Friedrich Eklef. Eklef, who had been to France during the 1740s and possibly was initiated into Freemasonry already by then, obtained rituals from a foreign Grand Chapter, allegedly from Geneva, Florence or Avignon, in a system that definitely was Christian and that divided into three distinct sections: craft, Scottish and chivalric chapter degrees, with a strong link to the tradition of Knights Templar. The first Masonic chapter lodge, Chapitre Illuminé, was established in Stockholm in 1759. At the same time, chivalric Freemasonry reached a significant peak throughout Europe. In the middle of the 7 Years' War, the chapter of Clermont, and more prominently the Strict Observance, took over loosely organized craft lodges, established Scottish lodges and chapters throughout European space. In the Swedish realm, and the Swedish possession on German soil, Pomerania, the second Scottish lodge and chapter lodge of the realm, Zum funkelnden Nordstern and Chapitre Sublime, were established. However, these were soon replaced by the Strict Observance and never accepted by Stockholm. For Freemasonry in Denmark, the influence of the Strict Observance is pivotal. At the time of the emergence of the Strict Observance, Denmark lacked a national Masonic body, and the lodges of Copenhagen, as elsewhere in the realm, willingly subscribed to this new Masonic body that organized itself in provinces across Europe. It should be stressed here that the general character compared between the Strict Observance and Swedish Freemasonry was very similar. Both were outspokenly Christian, divided into three separate yet united and progressive degree units from craft and Scottish to chivalric degrees, and both interpreted themselves in the tradition of the Knights Templar. The Strict Observance, however, also soon developed a mystical dimension. Alchemical and esoteric ideas were nurtured and cultivated. This led in 1767 to the foundation of the clerical branch in the port town of Wismar at the Baltic shore, at that time under Swedish possession. It was claimed that the clerics of the Order of Knights Templar now had resurfaced in order to communicate and share their superior knowledge. As a consequence, a union with the chivalric branch of the order was decided upon. Meanwhile, did Sweden during the middle of the 1760s experience a serious split in its Masonic culture, as lodges with an English warrant were constituted in Stockholm and the western port town of Gothenburg. It was claimed that the Swedish Grand Lodge not was regular, as it wasn't constituted from London. The reason for this English intervention are not entirely clear. However, it appears that also political motives played in, as Britain was interested in to breach French dominance in Swedish domestic politics. This internal schism lasted until the beginning of the 1770s, when the Grand Lodge of England accepted the irregularity of Sweden and listed it as number 3 among European Grand Lodges. The Swedish Rite for the first time was also exported outside Sweden. A Prussian physician who was not content with his strict observance had obtained a copy of the Swedish rituals of Eklef and in 1770 established the Große Landesloge der Freimaurer von Deutschland, a grand lodge working with these originally Swedish degrees up to this day. While the Danish development followed the ups and downs of the strict observance, the leadership of the Swedish Order of Freemasons was in the middle of the 1770s taken over by Duke Charles of Sudermania, who merged the offices of Grand Master and Master of the Grand Chapter into one. The subsequent close association of Freemasonry with the royal court, all princes and later on King Gustav III were Freemasons, caused a boom in membership, but Freemasonry developed at the same time also into a feature of a more esoteric court sociability. Duke Charles was interested in to strengthen the ties with continental Freemasonry and started negotiations with the strict observance concerning a potential union which was agreed upon and in existence during a couple of years at the end of the 1770s. However, his plan to take over the leadership of this order altogether failed, not at least since Danish members refused to be ruled by a representative from the court of an arch-enemy, against which they vividly protested. Duke Charles stepped down from his offices in the strict observance. The idea of a fusion was given up, and at the same time the ties to the Große Landesloge had been broken due to Masonic politicking. Gustav III was also ignited by the potential mission of Swedish Freemasonry and travelled to Italy, where he hoped to assume the alleged leadership over the historical order of Knights Templar from Bonnie Prince Charles, who lived his last years in exile in Florence. Swedish self-confidence was at its peak, and in 1780 it was decided to revive the 9th province of the order, formerly the so-called Archipelago. During a magnificent ceremony in the Stockholm Stock Exchange, Gustav III enthroned his own brother Duke Charles into the office as the Grand Master of this new Masonic obedience, stretching across the Swedish realm, around the Baltic Sea and into Russia. Russian contacts promised to be very fruitful, and a number of lodges working in the Swedish Rite were actually constituted. Due to internal tensions, the later Swedish-Russian War and political suppression, Freemasonry in the Russian Empire was very curtailed. However, some of these lodges survived until the early 19th century, and Masonic ritual as described in Tolstoy's War and Peace clearly resemble Swedish Rite ritual. 1782 marks the year when the system of the strict observance finally collapsed. The conflict preceding the abdication of Duke Charles from his offices did already hint at that it was an impossible task to keep together an all-European Masonic body where political, philosophical, financial and cultural ambitions overlapped and competed. On the eve of the French Revolution, the different directions within European Freemasonry were almost incompatible. Some Freemasons adopted a radically rational, enlightened agenda and sympathized strongly or joined the Bavarian Illuminati. Others delved deeply into the esoteric side of enlightenment, Rosicrucianism or Martinism, and others simply wanted to cultivate Freemasonry in its strict English fashion as an element of refined, enlightened sociability. At a convent in Wilhelmsbad in summer 1782, it was decided to abandon the strict observance, which opened up for multiple developments. It was now the Illuminati started proselyting among the European elites, and it was now lodges like those in Vienna called for a scientific Freemasonry. At the same time, alchemy and esoteric currents grew stronger and stronger. Freemasonry was vividly debated in the press. It was, however, a Danish initiative at Wilhelmsbad that carried away a sort of compromise victory. The Danish prince, Landgraf of Hessen-Kassel, was one of the leading characters in the strict observance. Together with Jean-Baptiste Villermot, a Martinist Mason from Lyon, he developed a new higher degree ritual that dismissed the idea that Freemasonry was a continuation of the Order of Knights Templar, but that on the same time kept some vital elements such as Scottish and chivalric degrees, yet in a modified and less pronounced fashion. This rite was subsequently called the Scottish Rectified Rite and played also a significant role as inspiration for the later establishment of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. The Landgraf of Hessen-Kassel cultivated deep esoteric interests and competed in this respect definitely with his Swedish counterpart, Duke Charles. The Scottish Rectified Rite was introduced to the Danish realm and in place until the middle of the 19th century. During the 1780s, Swedish Freemasonry expanded also to far places, like the Swedish trading post of Canton in China, while already during the 1760s a lodge had been established, and to the tiny colony of Saint-Barthélemy in the Caribbean, where a lodge and even a Rose-Croix chapter were incorporated into the Swedish Order of Freemasons. However, the development of Swedish Freemasonry came to a halt during the Swedish-Russian War of 1788 to 1790, the assassination of King Gustav III in 1792, and the reign of Duke Charles during the immaturity of Crown Prince Gustav IV Adolf. Since the 1780s, Charles had worked on a reform of the Swedish Rite, but it was only now, at the very end of the 18th century, he was in the position to rewrite the rituals and to introduce a new organization of the order. It appears as if he gathered inspiration during 2 travels to the continent, from which he was engaged in intense correspondence with leading Freemasons in Sweden. During the 18th century, no less than 4,300 Freemasons had joined Swedish lodges. In 1800, Duke Charles introduced his revised rite and organization that now has been in place with minor alterations only since 210 years. Swedish Freemasonry was during the first decades of the new century spread to the provincial cities and membership boomed. Within this period, almost as many as during the entire previous century joined Freemasonry. In 1809, Sweden lost Finland to Russia as a consequence of the Napoleonic Wars. Century-old ties to this eastern half of the realm were cut off, and due to the repression of Freemasonry in Alexandrian Russia, the lodges were dispersed. It was only after Finnish independence in 1917 Finland for the first time was able to introduce Freemasonry on the time it was from Sweden but from America. However, in 1923, Swedish Freemasonry also was revived in Finland as an body under Swedish Masonic jurisdiction, and both Masonic rites do exist. Yet another consequence of the Napoleonic Wars was that Sweden ceded German territory in the Vienna Congress. The lodges of Swedish Pomerania were integrated into the Prussian Grand Lodge, working with the older Swedish Eklef rite, a development that promoted appeasement and finally renewed the partnership between the Swedish and German Grand Lodges. However, the German lodges faced bitter persecution during the Nazi regime. Their belongings and property was seized, and individual members persecuted systematically. In Eastern Germany, Freemasonry was prohibited during the communist rule, and it is only after 1990 that the old lodges working in the Swedish Rite have been revived. These face, however, immense problems. In the Vienna Congress of 1815, Sweden was compensated with Norway, the former integrated part of the Danish realm. Almost immediately, the Swedish Rite was introduced there with huge success. This development opened up for that also Denmark introduced the Swedish Rite at the peak of a pan-Scandinavian mood in the middle of the 19th century. However, both in Denmark and especially Norway, national sentiments at the end of the century paved the way for the introduction of other rites as well. In Norway, a Grand Lodge was constituted by a warrant from the Grand Lodge of Bayreuth in Germany. And in Denmark, a Grand Lodge working in the English system was introduced. From the Swedish side, this development was met with to grant Norway independence in Masonic terms. The Norwegian Order of Freemasons was established during the 1890s, and in 1905 the political union with Sweden was suspended. After the Second World War, Iceland gained political independence from Denmark, and the youngest of Grand Lodges working in the Swedish Rite was established subsequently. The Danish, Swedish, Norwegian and Icelandic orders of Freemasons, and to a certain extent the German Große Landesloge, are all working in the tradition of the Swedish Rite, the constitutive features of which already were in place some 250 years ago. Finally, I would like to summarize the different developmental lines of Scandinavian Freemasonry. Swedish Freemasonry was deeply influenced by its French connections, both in formal organizational and in ritual terms. The craft degrees, rules and regulations were directly imported from France to Sweden, and French was spoken even within Swedish Freemasonry. This applies also to the import of higher degrees to Sweden from different sources, which led to the early establishment of a national Masonic body with international ambitions. Danish Freemasonry was generally from early on much more influenced by German connections, and German was the dominant language of communication in Danish Freemasonry throughout the 18th century. This applies to the first introduction during the 1730s and 1740s, and to the close links of Danish Freemasonry to the strict observance. It was only after the dissolution of the strict observance in 1782 that Danish Freemasonry started to develop its particularity, especially as mirrored by the Scottish rectified rite. However, the parallels between these two traditions were stronger than the differences, and partly due to political and partly due to ideological developments, also Denmark introduced the Swedish Rite in the middle of the 19th century. With a membership of around 50,000 members in all Nordic countries and recruitment figures boosting, the Swedish Rite in Scandinavia today is one of the most active in Europe. Its specific traditions and history are a fascinating area of research, and I hope that this lecture has contributed to a better understanding of its historical evolution. Thank you very much for your attention.